They say some old records do not tell a story. They merely carry a silence that no one has known how to translate. And it was exactly in this silence, scattered between yellowed pages and numbers misaligned by time, that the researcher found the sentence that would change the entire course of this file. Before proceeding, he left only a small note, almost an automatic gesture. Comment from which city you're watching, and what time it is there right now. It was not a request, nor a break in the narrative, just the way he found to place the reader in the same time zone as that distant past. The documents analyzed belonged to Blackthorne County, in the northern mountainous region, whose irregular topography made the winter of 1888 even harsher. There lived the protagonist of this file, Eleanor Whitford Blackthorne, known by the local community as the widow of Blackthorne. She had lost her husband, the merchant Nathaniel Blackthorne, 3 years earlier, after a long illness that drained the family's savings and the vigor of the house. Since then, Eleanor had lived discreetly, keeping only what was essential to maintain the small inherited property, which lay about half a mile from the main road. A short route, but isolated enough to turn any nightly noise into something few dared to investigate. The residence, built with sawn pine in the 1860s, had walls that held the persistent smell of old oil lamps, and windows that let in only enough light to reveal particles suspended in the air, as if time there moved at its own pace. According to the collected accounts, Eleanor rarely interacted with neighbors, except on Saturday mornings, when she went down to the village to trade eggs, flour, and small fabric she sewed by hand. She was observed as someone polite, reserved, marked by a sadness that was never openly mentioned, but always perceived. The village of Blackthorne was small, built around a Methodist church, a blacksmith shop, and a general store. In 1888, it had just over 150 inhabitants, almost all second- or third-generation immigrants, accustomed to the harsh climate and limited agriculture of the region. What united that community was not only the difficulties of rural life, but also a kind of silent pact. Each family took care of its own grief, its own debts, and its own absences. Perhaps that is why no one asked much about Eleanor, and perhaps that is why so many details of her story were lost in the void between one document and another. In the months leading up to the episode recorded in this file, some neighbors claimed to have seen lights on in Eleanor's house long after 9 at night, which was not common. Others mentioned having heard slow footsteps in the corridor that led to the back of the residence, but these observations always came accompanied by a gesture of withdrawal, as if the memory itself were too uncomfortable to sustain. None of this, however, seemed enough to raise suspicion at the time. The widow's withdrawn behavior fit perfectly into the region's silent pattern. The researcher, however, found something that did not fit. A handwritten note attached to the back of the property inventory record. The handwriting was rushed, irregular, different from the official script of the county clerks. The sentence simply read, "The lower room was once again sealed before sunset." The expression "lower room" did not appear in any of the other documents related to the Blackthorne house. It was not on the maps, nor in the inventory reports, nor in the descriptions made by the appraisers of the time. And yet, it was there, solitary, insistent, out of place. It was this detail, as small as it was disturbing, that lit the first warning sign in the researcher. And it is from this point that this account begins to take shape. Before he could go any further, however, a second sentence appeared a few pages later, like a displaced whisper among accounting data. That night, 26 pilgrims passed by the property. Nothing explained the relationship between the sealed room and the group of pilgrims. No later document offered clarification. Only this emptiness. An emptiness that, from this point on, makes it impossible to detach the silence of Eleanor's house from the fate of the 26 travelers who never reached the next day. The mystery, therefore, does not begin with a disappearance. It begins with a door that someone made a point of keeping closed. To understand what happened on the night when 26 pilgrims passed by the Blackthorne property, it is first necessary to enter the slow and rigorous rhythm of life in Blackthorne Valley. The months that preceded the disappearance were recorded only in fragments. Small store notes, wool receipts, scattered letters and testimonies collected decades later. Even so, taken together, they form a rare portrait of the widow Eleanor's routine and of how that isolated community perceived the world around it. The researcher describes that, at the time, the region's economy was sustained mainly by small corn crops, light cattle raising and improvised fabric trading. Eleanor, since her husband's death, supported herself mainly with fine sewing, repairs and blankets that she herself wove by hand as the afternoon faded. She worked near the east window, where the light came in softer. Neighbors who passed along the road said it was possible to see her sitting with her back straight, shoulders tense, slow movements, as if each stitch of the needle required not only precision but emotional effort. There was also a particularity about Eleanor that many mentioned in later testimonies. She spoke little, but heard everything. At the Saturday market, she rarely got involved in village matters, but seemed to absorb every word spoken around her. The blacksmith shop, the storehouse, the church pulpit, everything was part of a world she crossed, like someone who observes without allowing herself to be observed in return. Some said it was grief, others that it was prudence, and there were those who believed it was simply the way she had found to remain whole after so many losses. The winter approaching in 1888 was described as harsher than usual. The wind came down from the hills with a cold that made doors creak even when locked, and the morning fog seemed to take longer to dissipate. This directly affected everyone's daily life, including the widow's. It was at that time that pilgrims began crossing the region heading north, seeking shelter, religious consolation, or simply the promise of better lands beyond the county borders. It was common for travelers to pass near Eleanor's house, but rarely did anyone knock on her door. The path was narrow, night fell early, and few wanted to risk being far from the main village. Even so, a series of old reports mentioned subtle changes on the Blackthorne property. The first came from a distant neighbor, Martha Reeds, who said she saw Eleanor transporting a heavy wooden crate to the back of the house, helped by a carter who was not known in the region. They described the object as too large to be domestic, but too small to be for agricultural use. The crate was said to have disappeared from the yard the next day. When asked about this years later, Martha simply said she didn't want anyone to comment on it. Another account from Samuel Briggs, a young blacksmith's apprentice at the time, pointed out that the widow began buying long nails, reinforced hinges and tools that would normally be used to strengthen interior doors. Samuel remembers helping her carry the material to her cart and remembers above all the way she avoided eye contact. "It felt like every word of mine was a bother to her," he said in his testimony. There was no fear in Eleanor, but there was reserve, as if she were preparing something that required absolute silence. The researcher analyzing these details found an important correlation. Almost all the reported changes had to do with the lower part of the house, the same one mentioned in the note about the sealed room. The official maps, however, showed only 2 rooms on the lower floor, the kitchen and a small storage room. Nothing that justified so many modifications. Other details began to emerge when he interviewed descendants of the families who had lived in the area. There were mentions of how Eleanor avoided lighting lamps in the windows at night, preferring to keep the house in semi-darkness. There were comments about the sound of wood being worked for long, silent hours, and about how she always seemed one step behind her own routine, as if something distracted her constantly. But the most curious aspect, and one that appeared in more than one testimony, was the way she reacted when someone mentioned travelers. A girl from the time, now remembered only as LR in the files, said that once she commented on having seen a group of pilgrims resting by the roadside, and that Eleanor abruptly cut off the conversation, lowered her eyes and asked that the subject be left aside. The child, many years later, would recall this reaction as frightening but sad. These behaviors, recorded by different sources, suggest that something in Eleanor's routine was being carefully prepared or protected. But protecting what? Preparing for what? Nothing in the documents answers that directly. However, the atmosphere of the house, according to descriptions from the time, seemed increasingly heavy, not with fear, but with silent tension. The researcher describes this period as the time when everything was about to break. but there were still no visible cracks. And perhaps that is the best way to understand the context preceding the disappearance. Small, imperceptible changes added to long periods of silence. The night of the disappearance of the 26 pilgrims entered the records of Blackthorne not because of an immediate event, but because of the strange chain of small signs that, seen in retrospect, seem almost coordinated. The researcher arranges these fragments as someone assembling an old tapestry, thread by thread, testimony by testimony, until the final image begins to emerge, silent and inevitable. It all begins with the weather. The evening of November 12, 1888 was described as unusually calm. The wind, which usually lashed the hills before nightfall, stopped blowing that afternoon, leaving the air still, dense, almost mineral. The temperature dropped earlier than expected, creating a thin layer of ice along the edges of the horse trough in the village center. The residents remember the sunlight cutting through the fog like oblique blades, casting long, imprecise shadows. According to later accounts, a large group of pilgrims had been seen coming down the southern road in the afternoon. They were men and women of different ages, almost all travelers moving in search of religious assistance toward the neighboring county, where, according to rumors at the time, an itinerant preacher was offering shelter and food. There was nothing abnormal about groups like this passing through, but 26 was a high number for that time of year. Some residents recalled hearing scattered hymns, others only hurried footsteps. The fact is that the group passed through the village before heading toward the road that skirted the Blackthorne property, and it is precisely here that the fabric of the mystery begins to narrow. Around 7 in the evening, the wood of Eleanor's house registered the first sound, a short impact on the back door, as if someone had bumped against it with a shoulder. No document confirms this, but 2 witnesses mentioned years later having seen one of the interior lamps go out immediately afterward. It was rare for Eleanor to keep any light on at that hour, which made the observation even more notable. When the researcher analyzed the testimony of the neighbor Martha Reeds, who lived about 300 meters from the property, he found a detail that had always caught his attention. Martha reported having seen shadows moving on the side of the house shortly after nightfall. She did not describe people. She did not describe specific shapes, only shadows, long, slanted by the distant reflection of a fire lit near the road. "I thought they were travelers looking for shelter, but no one knocked at the door," she said. And the widow didn't seem to have lit a fire that day. From 8:30 on, other reports begin to converge. Samuel Briggs, the blacksmith's apprentice, claimed to have heard fast footsteps on the road. Footsteps that did not follow a marching rhythm, but one of dispersal, as if the group had fragmented. He describes muffled voices, like orders given in an urgent tone, and a distant metallic sound, perhaps a tool falling. No one knows whether this memory was affected by time, but its emotional precision was convincing. The researcher, aligning all the information, arrived at a precise hypothesis. The group of 26 travelers probably split upon reaching the crossroads where the road narrowed. Some followed the main path, others veered along the slope that passed behind the Blackthorne property. The reason for this detour was never clarified. Perhaps they were looking for water. Perhaps they got confused. Perhaps they were guided by the faint light that, according to reports, shone discreetly from the lower window of the house, the same window Eleanor always kept closed. And then, at 9:10 at night, the most disturbing piece of the puzzle occurs. One of the residents, identified only as EC in a 1904 report, claimed to have seen Eleanor at her doorway, motionless, holding something in her hands. The witness could not describe the object. He only said that she was standing there, looking out at the open field with an expression between resignation and weariness. The sighting lasted a few seconds, as the fog covered her figure shortly afterward. 15 minutes later, sounds began in the direction of the slope. They were not screams, nor cries for help. They were noises of abrupt movement, like people stumbling over uneven ground, slipping among rocks. Under normal conditions, this would have alarmed the community. But that night, with intense cold and reduced visibility, few dared go out to check. Only one man, the local pastor, claimed to have seen shadows running toward the valley, but his account was never confirmed. From 20 to 10 at night onward, all sounds ceased. The official documents record only that, the following morning, none of the 26 pilgrims was seen again. What is known is that their footprints appear in irregular stretches of the road and disappear a few meters later, as if the ground had swallowed the marks. No trace was found along the riverbank, on the old abandoned tracks, or in the nearby clearings. But the most unsettling detail of all emerges when the researcher returns to the records of the Blackthorne house. Among the last preserved lines, in almost faded ink, is this note: "At 9:50 the lower room was sealed. It shall remain so." There is no further explanation. There is no witness to confirm it. Only this sentence, which connects precisely with the moment when the group of travelers disappears forever from the region's records. Eleanor, the widow of Blackthorne, was not seen by neighbors again until the end of that week. This is the point at which the historical record fragments and where the silence of the house becomes as dense as the night of that November. Because the last confirmed piece of evidence is not a person, nor an object, nor a testimony. The last confirmed piece of evidence is a closed door, a door whose key was never found. On the morning after the disappearance, Blackthorne Valley seemed suspended between two silences: the ordinary silence of the early winter hours and the strange silence that arises when something is deeply wrong, but no one yet knows how to name it. The village awoke with the cold light that passed through rippled glass windows, reflecting on extinguished lamps and on the steam rising from kettles. Nothing at first glance indicated that 26 people had vanished during the night, until discreet comments began to circulate among the residents. A farmer returning early from the slope was the first to notice the signs of passage: irregular, disordered footprints, some sunk too deeply into the mud. They were found at the stretch where the road divides, but disappeared a few meters later, as if the travelers had suddenly changed route or dispersed in random directions. This drew attention, but did not raise immediate alarm. Travelers often got lost in that region. What no one imagined was that, on that morning, there would be no trail at all to follow. Throughout the day, families began asking about acquaintances and relatives who should have arrived in the neighboring county. The local pastor reported that one of the pilgrims, a teacher named Isaac Talloway, had spoken with him the previous afternoon, promising to return to the village within 2 days. When Isaac did not appear, a discreet unease spread among the residents. It was unlikely that such a large group had changed course without being seen. It was then that the first strange detail emerged. The house of the widow of Blackthorne remained completely silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. There were no tracks of footsteps in the immediate surroundings of the property, no sign that anyone had slept there. The neighbors, accustomed to Eleanor's discreet routine, were surprised by the temporary abandonment of domestic life. Around noon, 2 men decided to walk up to the front door. The preserved accounts say they found the wood cold to the touch, as if the house had spent the entire night without any source of heat. They knocked 3 times. Absolute silence. They knocked again. Nothing. The door was unlocked, but out of respect, or perhaps fear, they did not attempt to enter at that first moment. They preferred to alert the pastor and one of the former county clerks, who had some experience inspecting properties. When they returned to the house, now accompanied, they found the scene that would become one of the central points of the mystery. The front door opened easily, revealing a tidy yet stagnant interior, as if time had been interrupted inside. The table still bore circular marks from used cups. The loom was covered with a piece of fabric left halfway through, and a lamp rested on the sideboard with no sign of having been lit that morning. Nothing was out of place, except for the fact that everything seemed cold, still, far too quiet. And it was only when they reached the back corridor that the second critical point appeared. The door to the lower room, the same one mentioned in the documents as sealed, was closed with a new padlock made of dark iron, whose key was not found in any room of the house. The men tried to listen for any sound behind the door, but the wood was thick, and no noise emerged. The clerk noted in his report, "The lower door is sealed." There is no apparent justification for such reinforcement. The researcher, reviewing this document decades later, made a curious observation. The writing of that line seems to have been done with a trembling hand, as if the clerk were nervous or in a hurry. He describes nothing beyond that, but his pauses and corrections suggest discomfort. The search for the Pilgrims continued over the following days. Volunteers combed nearby trails, searched the valleys, followed tracks that quickly dissolved under the frost. No object, piece of clothing or sign of a campsite was found. The trail simply faded. Travelers did disappear in the region, yes, but never in groups, and never without leaving at least one final trace. Meanwhile, Eleanor's absence began to generate unease. The widow had not been seen since the night of the disappearance, and her house remained untouched. What most caught the community's attention was the state of the lower room. No one knew what was inside. The county inventory reports did not mention any underground room besides the small storage area. Even so, the reinforced door was there, as solid as it was inexplicable. Under growing pressure, the county decided to officially open an investigation. 17 people were interviewed, including neighbors, merchants, and travelers who had passed through the region days earlier. All the accounts converged on 3 points. The group of pilgrims was last seen on the southern road. Eleanor's house remained unusually lit that night. The lower room was sealed at the moment, immediately following the disappearance. No plausible explanation managed to connect these facts. This is where the researcher introduces the most delicate revelation. A statement that remained stored for decades, only coming to light during the revision of the files in 1932. It is a letter written by Martha Reeds, the neighbor who claimed to have seen shadows on the property that night. In her letter, she reports something she had never had the courage to declare publicly. I heard footsteps near the lower door. They were not the footsteps of just one person. They sounded like many. I ran inside my house because the sound stopped abruptly, and that scared me more than the noise itself. The letter goes on, describing the strange feeling Martha had when looking at the house for the last time that night. She saw no one. She heard nothing else. But she had the impression, a human, sensory impression, not a supernatural one, that the house carried weight, as if something in it had just changed. This is the point at which the researcher's revelation closes. There is no evidence of crime, nor of violence, nor of coordinated escape. But there are undeniable signs that night, someone or some group was on the property of the widow of Blackthorne, and that Eleanor was not among the residents who slept peacefully. The community, without answers, then rallied around a single consensus. The lower room, whatever it was, represented the last concrete link between the house and the missing travelers. And that is why the county decided to seal it officially. A decision that, according to some, only increased the weight of the silence that came from that door. Decades have passed since that November night, but the case of the Blackthorne Pilgrims has never stopped hanging over the county archives like a shadow that finds no rest. The researcher, in reconstructing this account, describes the feeling of walking among old documents as one who crosses a field where nothing grows, but where, for some reason, the soil still seems loaded with something unspoken. He was not looking for answers, only for a possible understanding. And perhaps that is why his conclusion does not present itself as a solution, but as contemplation. Later records show that the Blackthorne house remained closed for many years. The property, without direct heirs, was turned over to the care of the county, which restricted access to the area, claiming structural risk. Over time, the roof began to sag, the walls lost their varnish, and the front door, the one where Eleanor had last been seen, warped with the dampness of the following seasons. Even so, the lower room remained sealed, exactly as it had been found. In 1917, a team sent to assess the possibility of reusing the land reported that they could not remove the padlock from the room without compromising the entire surrounding structure. The records indicate that the evaluators decided to leave everything as it was, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of respect for the story that lay there, or perhaps out of instinct, a very human instinct, not to force doors that belong more to the past, than to the present. The researcher describes this period as the time of erosion, when questions begin to disappear even before answers arise. Many of the residents who had lived through the original events died without revisiting the subject. Others preferred to let the case get lost among the rubble of collective memory. And as the years went by, the disappearance of the 26 pilgrims became less an event and more a void, an absence that no one found words to fill. What remained, in fact, were details, small hesitations preserved in reports, tired expressions in old letters, lines that seemed to have been written by hands trembling more from the responsibility of the record than from the cold of the season. In certain stretches of the files, the researcher notes that there are repeated, almost anxious erasures precisely at the points where the lower room is mentioned, as if those who wrote them knew they were touching something they did not fully understand, and perhaps preferred not to understand. The figure of Eleanor, the widow of Blackthorne, also slowly dissolved over the years. Few photographs survived, almost all out of focus, captured at church events or taken by travelers passing through the region. In none of them does she smile, but there is something in her posture, in the angle of her chin, in the gaze that never seems directed at the camera, that suggests a woman accustomed to carrying weight, to keeping silence, to moving on the boundary between what can be said and what must be kept to herself. Perhaps this is the most human and most painful aspect of the entire story, the realization that, at some point, the lives of 26 travelers and the silent life of the widow crossed in a definitive way, and that this crossing was never fully understood. It is not a matter of hidden violence, nor of organized conspiracy. It is a matter of circumstances, decisions, fears, weariness, and paths that meet at the worst possible moment. In his final reflection, the researcher writes, "What makes this case unforgettable is not what is missing, but what remains." And then he explains, "What remains is the sealed door, the silent night, Eleanor's motionless gesture on the threshold of the house, the disappearance without a trace, the anguish of those who sought answers, the uncomfortable feeling that something human, profound, and fateful happened there, and that it can never be fully reconstructed. Because not all stories are meant to be completed. Some exist only to remind us that there are spaces in the past we cannot reach, even when we have documents, testimonies, and dates lined up. There is a limit beyond which history does not advance, and where only silence remains." The researcher ends his report with a short sentence scribbled in the corner of the last page, almost hidden among numbers and signatures. Some doors remain closed because no one would bear what the silence holds. And it is here, exactly here, that the account ends. An ending that does not resolve, it simply remains. An ending that does not answer, it merely observes. An ending that leaves the viewer standing before the same door that ran through this entire historical file. And the rest is just silence.